Welcome back to the History of Early Western Civilization. This is Professor Allen, and here is Lecture Day 8. So, this lecture, of course, is going to be continuing on with our period of Greek history, and in this specific instance, we will be covering Macedon or Macedonia. We'll first start off this video with recapping a little bit about what we covered last time, because again, Macedon is a bit different than the rest of the Greeks, and it's going to be important with some of how what they are as a people kind of play into things in these lecture videos. We also are going to continue on with our discussion about Philip II, the ruler of Macedon at the time, because he sets the backdrop of conquering all of Greece, and that when he dies, his young son, Alexander, who becomes eventually Alexander the Great, will take over, and will use what Philip created to eventually attack Persia, and invade Persia and try to conquer Persia. So we'll be talking about that. Over the next few videos, as well as the beginning of Lecture Day 9, we'll be covering Alexander the Great in quite great detail. Pun intended there, I guess. And so, interestingly, the reason why I cover him in such great amount and take so much time on him is because he's one of those people in history, and there'll be a couple others for the rest of this course that we cover more in depth than others, that I think it's important to cover because of a couple reasons, as you'll see when we actually start talking about him specifically. But later on, you'll understand that sometimes it's better to look at history on a big picture at times, and then sometimes focus into specific people and specific time and events to kind of get a feel better of what history is, and that understand that these are people. Yes, this was 2,300 and something years ago, or 2,400 years ago almost, but they are still people. And in Alexander's case, he was about 18 to in his late 20s when he conquered most of the known world at that time, which is incredible. He died in his early 30s. And so, yeah, it's just one of those crazy things that, yes, the times were different back then, but people are still people, and they are flawed. They also have sometimes very big accomplishments and stuff, and I think it's good to scope in on some figures because it's sometimes more interesting. You can get a feel of that person and their mindset maybe, or at least see what a person has done, as opposed to just, oh, this country conquers all of this territory and stuff like that. But in this case, you'll see how it's done from basically almost one man's perspective. So let's get started. We are going to be talking about Macedon, or Macedonia, and that is this portion of Greece, or the Balkans, okay, area right here, this dark pink area, and it eventually conquered under Philip II, conquered this area, Thrace, which was also a kind of considered backwards area, mostly just hills and a bunch of people that rode horses around, which became very useful for cavalry. Cavalry are the soldiers that fight on horseback. The people of Thrace were very good at that. And Alexander and Philip would use them later on in battles, okay? So, the people of Thrace. Again, the Greeks were considered more advanced, or, not only by their standards over Macedon, but in many kind of historical standards. They had, like, democratic republics at the time, where the people were voting. They elected officials and stuff like that, while Macedon was a kingdom. It was still, the ruler was from the royal family, and then when he died, then the next son would take over. The oldest son of that would take over. And so, the Greeks themselves kind of considered them backwards because of that, as well as just, they didn't feel like the Macedonians were as civilized. They drank undiluted wine, which we talked about in length last time. It was called drach. They spoke a Greek dialect that was very different compared to the other Greek languages. We talked a little bit about that last time. And one thing I forgot to mention, which is kind of important, is that they usually had very blonde hair. Very, very blonde hair, the Macedonians, as well as having other fair hair colors. So blonde, light brown, kind of dirtyish blonde as well. Sometimes darker hair, but very rare. And that's going to matter when we talk about a specific person as well. So, let's get back to Philip II, okay, Philip II, and remember he was ruler of the king, or ruled as the king of Macedon from the year 359 BCE to the year 336 BCE. And we talked about that last time. We also talked about his the reforms he made to the Macedonian army, where he gave or came up with the idea of using the sarissa, which was this long 18 to 24 foot long pike, you can see right here compared to the man there. They got rid of the hoplon, and because they got rid of the hoplon and they started using the sarissa and were kind of pikemen, they were known as the pesheteroi. They were no longer the hoplites, right? They were pesheteroi, because it's not the same as a hoplite if you don't have the hoplon, which was the big giant shield. These shields are much smaller. Sometimes they wouldn't even wield a shield. They would just hold on to the pike with both hands. The pike was able to get driven into the ground really deeply on the end, as also well use it as a counterweight by using this end, as well as the stabby end on the other end. But they could use this end to dig into the dirt, kind of as a wedge, so it was kind of slanted. And we've shown you pictures of that before. In the last lecture, as well as that video that I linked last time. And then with this army, as well as the Thracian cavalry, as well as his own companion cavalry, which was basically his royal bodyguard and the nobility of Macedon, he conquered most of Greece. And captured multiple Greek city-states. And as he was doing so, as we've already talked about in 357 and 352, he conquered two of the northern cities, Amphipolis and Thermopolis. There was a man named Demosthenes who wrote the Philippics about Philip, right? Literally about Philip. These Philippics, warning the rest of Greece about Philip of Macedon's attempted takeover of the rest of Greece. Because the city-states, they were all their individual city-states, right? They weren't countries. They weren't one big country, and they had squabbles. We've already talked about that during the Peloponnesian War, the Corinthian War, and other little skirmishes and fights afterwards. And while kind of like Thebes is kind of on top right now, it even still doesn't think that Macedon's ever going to come and get them, as it begins to take over city after city in Greece. And they're just like, oh, well, it's not our problem, it's their problem. Philip will get tired and stop, or someone else will beat him. It's not our time. While Demosthenes, this scholar at the time, and writer at the time, wrote these speeches, and he would go and basically speak out loud in the middle of the markets of multiple different city-states, explaining, we need to get our act together, or Macedon's going to take over all of us. And it was ignored. He was ignored largely by the Greeks until it was really too late. Until the Battle of Chaeronea, which we'll be talking about in just a moment. But first, a little bit of that background of the man that we'll be talking about in the rest of these videos for this lecture as well as part of next lecture. Before we get to a battle which he kind of makes his mark for the first time. Well, Alexander, or Alexander, okay, with a KS as opposed to an X, because they didn't, that was kind of how the Greeks spelled it originally. We have since anglicized it into the English language with the X. But Alexander the Great, as he becomes known as, okay? He becomes Alexander the Great. This is a statue of his head right there. He was born on July 20th or 21st of the year 356 BCE, and he was the second son of Philip II of Macedon. But his older brother was another Philip, okay? And we'll talk about that Philip in a little while. Olympia was Alexander's mother, or Olympias, depending on whichever spelling you want to use. It's okay. She was Philip's fourth wife, Philip II, the king, Alexander's father's fourth wife, and she was from not Macedon, and not the rest of Greece, but this area right here, this green area called Epirus. Epirus was a kind of strange area of Greece on its own, kind of very similar to Macedon, where it was counted as backwards by the rest of Greece. But Epirus eventually had very, just kind of different culture than the rest of Greece. And maybe that influenced Olympia a lot, and is definitely probably why she was counted as having strange beliefs by the rest of Macedon and the rest of Greece. Some of those exotic and strange beliefs were kind of almost considered borderline witchcraft at the time. She used to have a very fondness of having a lot of pets, specifically pet snakes. And she would even sleep with them. They would actually be in bed with her. She would take the snake to bed. And it was questionable whether there was anything else going on erotically with these snakes or not. That was the rumor going around by some of the Macedonian nobles. And she also used to say that she would go to bed with Zeus. Zeus, of course, was the leader of the gods, the head god of the Olympic gods. Okay, the Olympic gods were the gods of the Greek pantheon. Okay, and they were supposed to live up on the mountain of Olympus. And it's interesting that her name is kind of along the lines of that of their name, right? But Zeus was the god of lightning and thunder and all of that, and he was the king of the gods. Well, she said that she was seduced by Philip II, okay, her husband, who was possessed one night by Zeus, and that Zeus was the actual father of Alexander, not Philip. That it was only in Philip's body, and that Zeus was actually possessing him. And she raised Alexander the Great to believe that. For his whole life, she kept on telling him, "You are not Philip's son, you are Zeus's son." And it definitely gave him a bit of a god complex, or a son of a god complex. Alexander the Great was eventually tutored and taught by the great scholar, and we will talk about Aristotle, this scholar, quite a lot in the Greek culture portion of these videos in Lecture Day 9, but Aristotle was his personal tutor for a very long time, for most of his life, or most of his young life. And Alexander grew up reading the Iliad, okay, which, again, if you remember back to the day of the first Greek lecture, we were talking about the Trojan War in that, and that it didn't happen in real life. But at the time, the story handed down was in the Iliad, and then the Odyssey afterwards. And Alexander grew up reading it and believing everything in it. And there was at the time, no reason to not think it was real, because there was no archaeological evidence that they had shown that they didn't know it was real. So he grew up thinking that gods such as Achilles, which was a son of a god and the main antagonist or protagonist, depending on the side of the story you like, of the Trojan War, was real. He believed that Achilles, this man that was part son of Zeus or son of one of the gods, was part of this story and was real. And so why wasn't Alexander also one of these sons of these gods? So that brings us to when Alexander the Great has now been raised to to his 18th year of existence, and of course he has been trained to fight as well as educated to be a leader. He is now trained and he is put in charge of the cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea. And this battle is fought in the year 338 BCE, and it is fought in in basically middle of Greece, don't worry about where, and he wins. And it's basically, the Chaeronea is where the remaining city-states, Thebes and a couple others, Thebes, Athens, and one or two small other ones, band together to make an army against the Macedonian army, which is just at this point massive. And the Macedonian army wins. Alexander himself leads the cavalry, leads all the men on horseback, while Philip is actually on foot with all the pesheteroi, the pikemen. And at one point, Alexander and the soldiers with him end up stopping these reinforcements from attacking Philip's main line, where Philip is, and saves Philip. And because Alexander's cavalry stopped the reinforcements from making it there, Philip and his soldiers are able to win the day in the middle of the battlefield, because the enemy city-state reinforcements weren't able to beat Philip down. And so they are victorious. The Macedonians are victorious over the Greek city-states, and at that point, the city-states basically surrender. The Theban army, which was the majority of this army, is completely crushed at Chaeronea. That was the biggest portion of the Greek city-state army, and it's completely destroyed, the Theban army. And after this, Philip II of Macedon orders that all the Greek city-states send representatives together, and they're going to hash out this new peace treaty, kind of with Macedon on top, and what is formed out of that is called the Hellenic League or the Corinthian League. And so let's talk a little bit about that league. So, the Hellenic League is also known as the Corinthian League. Either one, it's fine. Doesn't matter which one you want to use. It is created by Philip II of Macedon in 338 BC. Right after the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip will take the title of hegemon, okay, which is the leader of the Corinthian League or Hellenic lead. And you can kind of see arrows symbolically of all the city-states kind of sending representatives to Macedon or vice versa, right? Where Macedon would send representatives to spy on all those city-states as well. He would be in charge right there in Macedon. And he and his heirs, so Alexander when he's old enough, or whoever takes over after Philip dies, and then if Alexander or whoever that king dies, their leader, their son, would be the next hegemon after that. Okay, so that for then on, the head of the Hellenic league would be the hegemon, which will always be a family member of Philip II's family. Okay, so his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, for then on, as long as this league is in existence, where basically Macedon is now control over the league, and thus over all of Greece, and is in command of Greece. That's what this means. And the Hellenic League members, the other members, are forced to abide by certain rules. These rules, there are several, okay, but the two that you need to know are the following. One is that the city-states may not have large armies of their own, okay? They can have an army to protect themselves, but a small one, nowhere near the size that they used to be. And at any time that Macedon wants to use an army or needs an army and help for their army, they can just send a letter to any of the city-states and say, hey, your army is needed to help us do something else. And those city-states have to abide by these rules, by that rule, or there'll be punishments, consequences. The other one is that they had to pay a tribute to Macedon every year. And this tribute varied from money or gold or silver, in that stance, to food, to other supplies such as wood, stone, whatever, weapons, whatever Macedon wanted. Maybe that city-state was famous for certain things. That city-state would be sending it to Macedon whenever Macedon was like, hey, pay up. And again, if they didn't do this every year, or even sometimes monthly and things like that, depending on how they broke it up, back then there would be punishment or consequences. And the punishment or consequences would be Macedon sending an army down to enforce those rules, okay, and kicking butt if necessary. And so that is that. Well, what's going on as well in Philip and Alexander's lives? Well, eventually, Philip is going to get married a fifth time. He keeps on getting married to all these different women. He doesn't really divorce the previous ones. It was just one of those things that the Macedonians did. They had multiple wives. That was part of their culture. Again, one of the things that is kind of frowned upon by the rest of Greece. In this case, he is going to be married to a woman named Cleopatra. You have heard of Cleopatra before, but it is not this one, okay? The one you are thinking of is an Egyptian one, and we will talk about her in many lectures from now. But, believe it or not, she is kind of related to this one, and we'll talk about that in the future, okay? But This woman is named Cleopatra, and she is a princess of one of the other Greek city-states. Okay? And Philip has his marriage. And if, at this point, Philip has another child, Alexander might not necessarily make it to be king. Because Philip at this point is kind of saying all the right things to Cleopatra, and Cleopatra's rest of her family, saying that if we have a son, that son will be the new heir, not my previous two sons. And so that means Alexander, who's second in line, might not get to be king, and his older brother is definitely not going to be king, and we'll talk about why later on, okay? And so it's kind of interesting that Alexander hears all this at the wedding reception, like after the wedding's taken place, and everyone is drinking Drock, okay, the extremely potent wine at the time, okay? So you can imagine the setting right now, that there's this giant wedding party, that everyone is not drinking water, because that wasn't drunk back in the ancient world much. You drank wine. And in this case it was Drock, meaning that it was unwatered down wine, undiluted wine. And so everyone is drinking extremely potent alcohol, and Alexander is hearing Philip at one point also insult Olympias and say that, and insult his past wives altogether, and claiming Cleopatra as the most beautiful, wonderful wife ever, and it's only, within an hour or so of this. And so Alexander gets into this argument with Philip, and they are both extremely drunk, and Philip and Alexander almost come to full-on blows, where they almost start hitting each other. They definitely throw their cups of Drock at each other, and Alexander basically is called a bastard by Philip. Philip says, well, you're not really my son, because Olympias says you're not my son, that she slept around on me, that I don't care what she says, that it was Zeus in my body. It was probably not even me. She's probably sleeping around. And so Alexander responds in kind, extremely angrily back, and insults Philip. And Philip's, at this point, says to Alexander, you are no longer allowed in Macedon. Get out. And so Alexander is exiled after this argument at this wedding reception in the year 338 BCE. So he's about 18, still. 18-year-old, kicked out of not just his home palace, and argument with his father, but kicked out of the kingdom. However, eventually through letters and through a little bit of some of Philip's suggestions, because from Philip's generals, okay, suggesting to Philip, they say, you should really bring back Alexander the Great, or Alexander, he wasn't called the Great back then, Alexander to the kingdom. You don't have an heir that is suitable to be crowned. Cleopatra's still not given birth to a son for you yet. It's time that you come and let Alexander back, because you do need an heir just in case. A suitable heir. That your other son is not suitable for multiple reasons. Health reasons. And so Philip says fine, he can come back. So by the year 336 BCE, so 2 years of being gone, Alexander is welcomed back to Macedon. Philip's daughter, Alexander's sister, or half-sister, is supposed to be married on Alexander's return. He comes back and stays for a few months, and all of a sudden Philip is marrying off his daughter to one of the heads of city-states elsewhere. And during this wedding, Philip kind of says something to Alexander and is then supposed to walk to the ceremony in this big arena, in this big arena where they're all going to have the ceremony. And one of the bodyguards or companions, okay, the companion bodyguard as they were known as, one of Philip's own bodyguard members runs up to Philip with a knife and stabs him multiple times. And Philip drops, dying. Alexander the Great, or Alexander, runs to his father's side and tries to help him, but there's really nothing that can be done. And we have At that point, the rest of the guards at the wedding go and find that companion, and they were ordered at first by the generals to capture him alive, but when they get to him, they kill this bodyguard that had killed and assassinated Philip. Well, this bodyguard was supposed to be buried completely with complete shame, okay, and just had his body burned or anything, and nothing, and no real funeral. But Olympia, okay, Philip's former wife, goes to the companion's body and puts coins on his eyes, which is kind of the sign of making sure that he gets into heaven. And so there's this kind of question whether Olympia or Olympias kind of put this companion, this bodyguard, up to killing Philip. Because she knew at this point Alexander was kind of going to be the new king if Philip died. And if Cleopatra ever finally gave birth to a son, then that would be kind of ruling that out. And so maybe Olympias manipulated this companion into wanting to kill Philip. And so that's what ends up happening. And so it's kind of questionable on whether that happened, whether that was Olympias' actions or not. But there's a lot of conspiracy theories back then and conspiracy theories now today about that specific happening in history, because it's unclear. Antipater, one of Philip's best generals and second in command of his armies, is the general and a mentor to Alexander. And he actually tells all the other generals, we need to declare Alexander as the new king. It will keep the country stable. Otherwise, all the Greek city-states might try to fight against us if they find out Philip is dead and there's just a question on who gets to be king. And so Alexander is at 20 years old now, and he is crowned Alexander III, because there had been previous Alexanders that had been king of Macedon. Alexander is also, by default, in charge of everything is read in this. This is his mother's area, mother's country, and they're kind of allied with the rest of Macedon, but the rest of anything that's red is owned by Macedon. As you can see, Sparta's by itself, because it keeps on defending well against Macedon, and really at this point it's kind of worthless. But that's about the only place in Greece that's not Greek. I mean, not controlled by Macedon, is Sparta. And so Alexander is not just king of Macedon, he's now controlling all of this red area. And the city of Thebes decides it is going to take advantage of this weakened state of Macedonia, where Alexander is now becoming king, and he's only 20, and they're thinking, oh, well, if we revolt, he's not going to come after us. Well, they revolt the following year in 335 BCE, and Alexander takes an army to Thebes, destroys the city after putting down the army, and he enslaves every single last man, woman, and child that is left alive in the city. So it shows that if you cross Alexander, you get wrath, and he gets very angry and goes out for revenge, and that is exactly what happened in this case. So, of course, you've got the map of Macedon and all of Greece, and Thebes is destroyed in 335, and Alexander's basically in control of everything else that's red in this map. And so if we scope out a little bit, he owns everything that's purple at this time in Greece. Of course, here is Persia, and it extends off-map. Here is some of the former Phoenician colonies that are kind of their own thing. Italy is being controlled by Rome at this time, which we'll talk about in the next section after Greece of the course, as well as also some other city-states and stuff that are the colonies of Greece. But they're kind of separate from Macedon. They're the only ones that are kind of still on their own. And so that is the Greek world as of Alexander becoming king. And so next video, we will continue talking about Alexander and his plans for what he is going to go do next, as well as some of the other main characters that we'll be talking about from that period.